Hello, I'm Kerry from Living in Loveliness, and today I'm going to show you how to make the placemat from issue 5 of your fabulously fast fat quarter fun So Starstruck. For this project you're going to need your pattern booklet, your templates, and there are a lot of templates in this pattern, so my recommendation would to be when you cut each piece, just keep those templates pinned to the panel of fabric. This will certainly make it easier when coming to put this project together. Of course, you could write the letters onto each piece as step 1 in your pattern does recommend, but I find it much easier having those panels just clipped using one of the quilting clips to each piece of fabric. You're also going to need a sharp pair of scissors when you're cutting your project, certainly when you're cutting through that batting, to glide through that batting. You're going to need a turning tool just to allow for those nice points to complete that placemat. You'll need a ruler and a fabric pen. This is to allow you to draw directly onto the fabric, and this will remove when you're pressing your project a little while later. You're going to need a small pair of scissors to trim away all those extra threads, lots of pins for this project, and of course we always need our stitch unpicker close by just in case we encounter any hiccups. I would recommend using a 505 spray. This is when you're going to attach that centre star, and also when you're going to attach the batting directly to the fabric panel and the back panel as well. Always have close by your iron and your pressing mat. It will allow for a much better finish on all of your projects. For this particular project there isn't a template for the back. We're simply going to have an oversized piece of fabric and batting so we can place the placemat on top and cut around the panel at our leisure when we come to that stage. So let's just make a little bit of space. And first of all, what we're going to do is lie those fabrics out in the order as shown in your pattern booklet. So we'll keep the star to one side for now. I've cut all of those pieces. Now we'll just keep that clip together so we're not losing any of those pieces. And the next thing I'm going to do is to just place all of the panels out to create that placemat. So let's just make a little space for ourselves. The main panel, which I've chosen a Blue Liberty, to really allow those floral fabrics to pop when we pop that centre star on. So I'm going to pop that flat to begin with. Then we'll pop our two, let me just double check, our two B pieces at the top and the bottom of our A piece just there. And as we work through the project, we can start to remove the clips and lose the piece of paper. The next panel is our C piece, which I've chosen this really beautiful vibrant floral to make those fabrics pop. Then we've got our D piece, which is actually the little pocket, and then we have the E piece, which is the binding for the pocket, and I have chosen to incorporate that blue again to break up the florals but also to bring the colour across the panel as well. So now I've got those placed out into position. What I'm going to do first of all is to just attach the binding to the pocket. So simply popping this onto our ironing board, we'll just make a little bit of space. So this is working with your E piece, and we're going to place that onto the ironing board with the wrong side of the fabric facing up towards you, and just press this in half along that raw edge. Once we've pressed that in half, the next thing that we can do is to line that up on top, let me just confirm that letter, of the D piece. So this is actually our pocket piece. Once we're happy with those fabrics, we'll just pop a couple of clips on there to secure those into place. And let's work through each step one by one. So I've chosen to work with a really beautiful, in fact I might change the colour of my thread. I've actually got a red thread on the top of the machine. I'm going to change this over to a nice blue thread so I can really see those fabrics pop, and it's a very similar colour to that centre blue, which will stand proud when we're going to do the quilting around the little star in a while. So once you're happy with your top thread, I've changed my mind, which is fine. I think we always do when we're having a little look at the fabrics. We're simply going to sew that binding strip into place using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. My stitch length is currently on 2.4, And when I arrive at the end of the binding, I'm simply going to remove the binding, remove those joining threads. Return this back to the pressing mat, and with the right side of the fabric facing up towards you, as you press that binding away from yourself or away from the pocket, what you'll notice, if we just give this a little press on the back as well, what you'll notice on here is that raw edge of the fabric is facing up towards the folded edge of the binding. Naturally now, as we fold that binding over, so we're folding the binding over to the wrong side of the fabric and giving that a real good press. We need to make sure, let's just pop a little clip on there, that that folded edge is sitting just below the stitch line. That will allow the fabric to distribute equally onto the front of the panel and onto the back of the panel. Returning this now to our sewing machine. And this is a great opportunity to use any of those decorative stitches. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch. You could use any of the stitches on your machine. Perhaps you've got a nice flower on there, which would pick out the flowers in the fabric. If you're making this in Christmas fabrics, you may have a little Christmas tree, which I think would look fabulous. But I've used that lovely zigzag stitch there. By using that zigzag stitch there as well, we're distributing that zigzag across the binding, and we know that we've caught that binding and secured that into place on the back of the project. If we just return this now to the panel, so just popping this back into place and we line that up, we can now go back to our A and B pieces. So the A and B pieces form that top panel, which is actually going to be where you would position your plate. What we're going to do, let me just double check, the B pieces, so these are the top and bottom pieces, as we fold that over towards the A panel and clip that into place, we're simply going to sew along that raw edge. And we'll repeat that step for the bottom panel as well. So folding the bottom panel up, aligning those raw edges and clipping those into place. We're going to pop these onto the machine and sew across the two raw edges where our clips are secured into place. Return your stitch back to a straight stitch. My stitch is on 2.5. And just using that 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting with a reverse stitch and finishing with a reverse stitch, we're going to secure those fabrics into place. When you arrive at the end, if we just take a moment to remove those extra threads and sew along the next panel, again using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take a moment to remove those threads. And what we're going to do next is to just place this back onto the fabric, turning over the panel. So this time, where's my little scissors? There we go. So trimming away those extra threads. And what we're going to do now is to push those seams. And I would always recommend for this project, pushing those seams to the darkest of the fabric, which is the blue on this particular project. So I'm working from the wrong side of the fabric. Turn this around just to make it easy for myself. Pushing along those raw edges. Turning the panel over and just giving that a top press. First of all, that's going to make sure there are no folds in the fabrics at the seam, and it will also make sure that we've set that seam. And you can see just how beautiful that fabric is. It really allows that blue to pop with a floral on the outside. Now the next thing we're going to do is to attach the pocket. So what we're doing here is just having the panels, always placing it back in the order as shown on your pattern. Fold the fabric over the top, so lining the pocket up with the bottom part of the placemat, making sure those raw edges are marrying up, and making sure the top of the, let me just double check, of the C panel is marrying up at the top of the panel. Just bring that in so you can see that. And what we're doing here is just sliding a pin through the fabric, so through that binding first of all to secure the binding into place, and the top and bottom of our projects just here. and we're simply going to sew along that seam to secure the pocket into place. We really want to make sure we're securing that pocket into place, so just take a moment to make sure that's straight. I've allowed the pins to stay a good finger space back from that raw edge, so I know that I'm not going to come into contact with the pins. Bringing this back to the pressing mat, trimming away those extra threads and removing those pins. And you can see just how fast this project comes together. This is a great project to make for any table, whether it's your barbecue table, whether it's a picnic that you're going on. These would wrap up beautifully, so if you've got a lovely celebration and you're having an outdoor picnic, these will roll with the batting inside there. And the next thing that we're going to do is to just press that raw edge. In fact, we'll bring that into the darkest of the fabrics just there. Turn this back over, and again, just pressing along that seam to make sure we haven't got any puckers or folds into the fabric. Now, there isn't a template for the back of this project, so what we're going to do is to work with an oversized piece of batting. Let me just find my batting. Place this flat onto the table. We'll just remove that backing fabric for a moment. And just using a little 505 spray, which is optional. You don't have to use this. We're going to place the mat on top in the centre. So just rolling your hands around, making sure that that is secured into place. The next thing we're going to do is to just add some really simple top stitching. I'm going to move the pocket back and top stitch the full length of that pocket. Really, this is just decorative, so you can skip this part if you want to, or you can put lots of quilting on here. It's entirely up to yourself. Starting from this little seam here, I'm going to line my machine foot up in line with that seam and sew a straight line, just some nice easy straight line quilting on either side of that seam, and I'll also repeat that on the top as well. So let's just create a little space here. So first of all, onto the machine, folding back that pocket out of the way, lining up the foot, making sure that's running in line with the seam. I'm going to increase the stitch length to a 5, so this is my basting stitch, and I've got that beautiful blue thread and I'm going to sew along the full length of that panel there. So when you look at that panel, you can see that beautiful stitching. And then we'll just close that up. Bringing this back onto the machine, I'm simply going to line the side of the sewing machine foot up with that seam between the two fabrics. Again, using the straight stitch, sewing along the full length of the project. And when I arrive at the seam, so where you see the seam, you can either reverse stitch, or I'm going to use just a locking stitch to secure that into place. Raising the presser foot, I'm going to pivot the project, tease a little thread out, and drop the needle into the fabric. Again, using a locking stitch, and then I'm going to sew along the full length of that seam one more time. Just sewing just beyond that stitch line, and I'm going to cut away that extra thread, and then we've got those two lovely sew lines. I'm going to repeat this on the bottom. So again, sliding this under the machine, folding this batting over so it's just resting under your machine and it feeds through nice and easy, lining up the side of the sewing machine foot on that seam line, and again sewing along the full length of that project. When I arrive at the seam, I will just finish with a nice locking stitch, raise the presser foot, tease a little thread out, pivot my project, and come across to the next section where I'm starting on the seam. So starting with a locking stitch and sewing along the full length of that project. allowing the side of the machine foot to run in line with that seam. When I arrive at the end, I'm simply going to remove the thread. And this really is an opportunity to just trim away all those joining and excess threads, as we don't want them to get caught up in the next part of the project. So take a moment to trim away all those threads on the front and on the back of your project as well. It's surprising how many threads we collect along the way. So just turning this over and again removing all those joining threads, or certainly the threads that are hanging loose at this stage. So that is the top part of your placemat. We're still going to leave that extra batting on there. You can see just how wonderful and how fast this comes together. Now this section here where we're going to add the star is personal preference. You could absolutely leave those the way they are. Perhaps you're using a fabric in there that you don't need to cover, that has enough detail in there. Perhaps you've done a little fussy cutting and perhaps you want to leave that just plain. But because the tutorial shows you, I'm going to show you how to create that little centre star, which I think brings the rest of the fabrics from your monthly subscription or from your remnants and really showcases those in the centre of the project. So from your template, you've cut two pieces from 3 different fabrics to create this little diamond, these little diamonds, which at the end is going to create this star. So I'm going to, in fact, I'm just going to, I can see I've dropped my coaster, and I want those in the same order as the coaster so they complement each other when they're sitting at the table. To do that, I'm simply going to mirror that pattern, just making sure the placement is the same as the placemat. Popping those out into the order and just looking that we've got the 2 pinks opposite each other, the floral with there's more blue in this floral, and then the really beautiful vibrant pinks and lilacs, so they're sitting opposite each other. And these are really small pieces to work with, so we'll only need 1 pin for this step. But what we're going to do is bring the first diamond on top of the centre diamond, making sure those points are marrying up. Slide a pin through, and we're going to rest this onto the sewing machine, still using that 1/4 inch seam, and sew along that raw edge. Nice and slow. In fact, I'm going to do that again and just reduce the stitch. I hadn't changed the stitch, and we want a nice close stitch on this section here, so I will just sew that line one more time. So my stitch length is 2.4. So we'll trim away those extra threads, and because we've sewn it twice, we've got lots of threads on this section. Take away that pin. Now the pressing is super important, because when we press the centre seam here, what we need to happen is that that centre diamond still looks like a diamond. So the raw edge is pressing towards that first diamond. You can see a close-up picture of this in your booklet. So just turning that over, giving that a real good press both back and front to set that seam. And then we're bringing the third diamond, resting those raw edges, making sure those raw edges are marrying up, sliding the pin through. And what's super important here is as we sew down this raw edge, that 1/4 inch seam line will come off just at that little angle there where those points match. So let's bring this back onto the machine. There we go. I had a feeling I'd turn that off, bringing that across, using that 1/4 inch seam allowance and sewing along that raw edge. Take this off the machine, remembering to remove all those joining threads. And as we remove the pin, you can see just how quickly the second section matches up. Now you'll know the correct way to press your seams, because what we don't want to happen when we press the seams is you've got this little diamond poking out. When you're pressing the seams, naturally this should feed across and run in line with that raw edge. So just giving that a little press. Turning this over, another little top press, and you can see there, this is nice and bold, you can see the 1/4 inch from that raw edge until you meet that diamond, and that will allow you to achieve that really beautiful centre point. Now we've done this on this section, we're going to repeat this on the bottom. So again, starting with that first diamond, we're going to place that on top, making sure the raw edges are marrying up. Slide the pin through the project, bring that onto the machine, and sew along that raw edge. Take a moment to remove those joining threads, take away those pins, pop this back onto your pressing mat, and just making sure that when we look at this from the wrong side, we're pressing the seam towards that first diamond, turning this over and giving that another little press. You've still got the shape of that centerpiece diamond there. So as we bring the third diamond on top, lining up those raw edges, slide the pin through, and we'll use that 1/4 inch seam allowance on the project again. So here, when we rest this onto our machine, naturally this is going to tuck onto the machine, and we'll start sewing here at this 1/4 inch mark and across that 1/4 inch. And it really is a super cute little star. So it only has a small distance to travel across the machine, keeping this a nice, easy project. Turning this back onto the ironing board so you can see the wrong side naturally as you press that seam towards the raw edge. Again, you can see that that's straight at the bottom and you have that 1/4 inch. This makes it really easy when we come to sew these two little diamonds together to create that star. So placing this flat onto the mat, resting this on top, naturally you're going to see those seams and you can feel through where they're nesting together. Slide a pin through at the centre, and I always slide 2 pins through either side of that seam, which you can see just here, and just making sure that that outer edge is marrying up. Slide a third pin in there, and on this side as well. And all that's left to do to complete this really cute little star is to rest this onto the machine, use that 1/4 inch. If you feel like your needle is going to come into contact with your pins, please take a moment to remove those. And we're sewing across that star, which is really small. So this can be the fiddliest part of this particular project. Take away those pins, trim away those excess threads, and this really is the moment of truth. Have we got a nice center? Have we got a nice center star? As we press the seams from the back, we're going to press the seams just up and away from us. Give that a real good press on the ironing board just there, and we can see we've got a really nice center star. Just give that a real good press to press out those little pennants there. And we've got that lovely point in the center, and we're ready to pop this onto the placemat. Now there are a number of ways that you can attach this. You could absolutely use the applique technique using the fusible webbing, but just for easiness today, using the back of one of the templates, I'm simply going to spray a little 505 spray onto the wrong side of my square star, and take this and place it onto my mat. Now I really want to find the centre of the mat, so to do that is really nice and easy. What we're going to do is hold the raw edges, marry up those raw edges, and just press along the mat. I can see my little seam line here, there we go, and I can see where my seam finishes here as well, my sewing. So what I'm going to do next is bring those 2 stitch lines into place just to find that centre point, and really pinch through those layers of fabric to find that centre point. There we go. Let's just do that again. It's not quite showing. So finding that centre point. Once you're happy with the centre point, we'll then find the centre of our star. And decide really which of your fabrics is the favourite. Mine is this really vibrant pink, and that's what I want to be the focal point of this star for my project. So I'm going to line those up on the top, so making sure they're running in line with that first crease, and making sure that these centre points of the star are running parallel here. And just give that a real good press. This is only a temporary adhesive, so we want to secure that into place. Trim away all these extra threads. And there are a number of ways that you can sew around this star. You could hand sew around the star if you wanted to. You could zigzag around the star. You could use a straight stitch around the star. I'm going to use a satin stitch here, so I'm really going to make this star pop. To create the satin stitch, I'm going to select a zigzag on my machine. I'm going to reduce the stitch length. What I would recommend is just using a scrap piece of fabric. Just play with your machine. And your satin stitch is a really close zigzag, so I just want to check that I'm happy with that. I want that a little closer, so I'm going to reduce the zigzag. I want that wider. So on my machine, what I've done is I've selected the zigzag stitch. My stitch width is 2.0 and my stitch length is 0.8. And this will give me a really nice close satin stitch. If you wanted that wider, you could absolutely play with that. These settings are on the inside of the pattern that I've used here. And this really is an opportunity for you to play with your machine. Make sure you have plenty of bobbin. And we're simply going to rest this onto the machine now, starting in the middle of one of the stars, not on the point and certainly not in the centre. And we're simply going to allow the project to feed around the machine using that satin stitch. So I'm centering the foot between, that's it, centering the foot between the raw edge of my star. When I arrive in the centre of the star, I'm simply going to insert the needle, raise the presser foot, and again sew along. So take your time with this, because it's particularly difficult to release these stitches if you're not happy. So this is definitely the stage that I would say really take your time with this stage. And we're simply following around the outer raw edge of each of those diamonds to really make that star pop. When I get to either the point or the centre, I'm simply reversing the project. And this will give a really bold blue line around the project. And this really is a great opportunity to use those stitches or to use those threads. Perhaps if you were making this for Christmas and you've got some nice metallic threads in your Christmas bundles, you could use a nice metallic thread. If you enjoy hand stitching, you could do some hand quilting to create some beautiful echo quilting on there. Or you can follow the step-by-steps that is in your pattern. There we go. So I would really recommend slowing down the speed on your machine and taking your time with this stage. Let's see if you can see just there. And pivoting each time. On that last two stars now. I'm almost back at that first diamond, so I do want to take a moment to just trim away that top thread to ensure that that doesn't get tangled up, because it's particularly difficult to take that away if it does get tangled into the project. And we're back to the start point on our star. So we'll just sew a little further than where we started. Now, if you've done that satin stitch and it's not quite as bold as you were hoping, you could absolutely sew around that star again to really make that star pop. You could use a variety of colours on here. And if you're not particularly happy with the centre of your star, there is no reason why you couldn't continue to sew across each of these lines. Again, it would cover that centre part of the star if it's not absolutely spot on or you're not happy with it, and it would just look part of the design. So we've got the top part of the placemat ready. What we're going to do now, using some really sharp scissors, is to simply cut away this extra batting. So we're cutting along the raw edges of our panel, ready to pop our batting piece onto the back. If you've got a mat and a ruler, you could absolutely use your mat and ruler to square up this project. If you prefer to work with a rotary cutter and ruler, that is. Now, just a little top tip for you. What we don't want to happen is for this pocket, when we put the back on, to be at an angle. So what I would recommend doing at this stage is to just hold that into place. Make sure you're happy and it's nice and straight. Slide a pin through the binding and just add a little basting stitch on there to secure that into place before you come to sew the backing on. And you're simply just sewing, just return this back to a straight stitch, 2.5, and you're only sewing across that binding piece there. Using the backing fabric, so I've chosen a pink to complement the other projects that I've created. But you could use a plain fabric, a floral fabric if you wanted to. So do take a moment to remove that pin. Place this onto your fabric. And what we're going to do now is to just pin around the whole outer edge of the panel. So first of all, I'll start by popping pins through the corners. Trimming away that extra fabric. Again, you could trim this down using your rotary cutter and ruler. We seem to have a little bundle of scraps building very quickly. There we go. Just slide a few more pins in, just because we've got so many layers. So I've pointed the pins towards the corners. I'm going to feel through the fabric here, and even though I've created a basting stitch, I'm just going to pin back through that binding so I know that I've caught the binding. And on the bottom of the placemat now, or any one of the sides, it actually doesn't matter for this particular project, we're going to leave a 2.5 inch turning gap. So just using either your ruler or your pressing mat if you have one. Actually, I'll leave 3.5. So I'm just drawing 2 pen marks using a heat erasable pen for my turning gap. I'm simply going to start at the first pen mark, sew around all 4 sides, finish with a reverse stitch at the second pen mark, ready to reverse this project. So again, placing this onto the mat. There we go. Starting with your reverse stitch, sew into that first corner. And when you arrive at the corner, just simply drop the needle into the fabric, pivot your project. Make sure the side of the sewing machine foot is lining up with the raw edge of your batting. If you've left your pins far enough back, you won't need to worry about removing these at this stage. Again, dropping that needle into position. Arriving at that third corner, dropping the needle, raising your presser foot, pivoting your project. And we'll see here where we're sewing across this binding, down to the 4th corner, dropping your needle into position, pivoting one more time and sewing to that second pen mark and finishing with a reverse stitch. If you do feel like you're going to come into contact with any of your pins, do take a moment to remove those so we're not sewing across those pins. And as we remove those pins now, we're almost ready to have a little look at the placemat. But before we do that, we're just simply going to clip the corners, and we'll clip the corners by angling our scissors an inch away from the point on each side, so we get a nice finish. If you have missed any of your fabrics, which is easily done, I actually thought I'd done it there, you can just double check and pop this back onto your machine and just sew across that little section. Slide your fingers through that little turning gap all the way to the furthest point and tease that project through your hole. We've got a 2.5 inch hole there. I think we actually went for 3.5 inches, didn't we? So that's more than enough to feed the project through your turning gap, and just poke your fingers into each corner. So first of all, I tend to pinch onto the corners and poke them out with my finger, and then just using your little pointy tool, just slide this inside the placemat and push each of those corners out. There we go. And this is your opportunity to decide what stitch you're going to use to top stitch. And if we give this project a little press, first of all, what I tend to do is push that seam inside and just give that a press. That'll naturally rest inside and give you a nice finish. Press around all of the edges of your project. Check that you're happy and that your binding is straight. I always tend to flip the project over and just give the back a little press as well. And I always slip stitch this turning gap here. It's very easy to put this onto the machine and sew straight across there, but I do find you don't get the best finish, so it's always worth just taking a moment. We've pressed that seam in and we're just going to slip stitch that gap closed. So catching on the inside of your project and just pulling that thread through. Making sure those raw edges are tucked nicely inside. And when we arrive at the end of that turning gap, all we're going to do is to just tuck that loop over our little finger, tease the needle through, tuck it into the loop and pull that nice and tight. And just one more time. And then trim away that excess thread. Now you don't need to top stitch this, but I would always recommend top stitching this just to give it a real nice finish on there. So just slide a few pins in the same positions as you did, one pointing to each corner and one in the centre. There we go. And I always push it whenever working with binding through that binding. And to finish, we're simply going to top stitch around the outer edge of the project. Because we've used a zigzag stitch, you could use a zigzag stitch, and because we've used a straight stitch, you could use a straight stitch or any of those decorative stitches. I'm simply lining the side of my sewing machine foot onto the project just a little further down from the binding. I'm increasing my stitch length to 5 so it will travel around the project in the same way as I did on the top quilting. And we're simply going to sew around the 4 sides to complete this project. When you arrive at the corner, simply drop your needle into position, raise your presser foot and pivot. make sure the side of the machine foot marries up with the folded edge of your placemat, and sew along to your third corner. Drop your needle into the fabric, all the time making sure that fabric is flat so you can't see any of the bottom fabric exposed. And we're on that fourth corner now. So this thread doesn't get caught up in the stitching, I'm simply going to cut where the thread started on both the front and the back of the project. Pivot one more time and sew to that next. Just sew a little further beyond where we started. And finish with a locking stitch. Take this off the machine and trim away those extra threads. As we remove the pins, we've already given this a top press and we're ready to sew the next placemat. I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. I look forward to seeing all of your beautiful placemats. Maybe you have some little hexes, some little hexie templates in your collections. Maybe you're going to add X's on there or some other applique. I've really enjoyed showing you how to create the star placemat from issue 5 of your fabulously Fastback Quarter Fun sewing series. I look forward to seeing your pictures in the VIP group on Facebook. Remember, if you do have any queries or if you're stuck, please just tag me, and when I'm online I will come and respond to all of your inquiries. Thank you for joining me today. Bye bye for now.